Okay, so this is our last story for the semester. Well, no, yeah, for the section before we go on to the test. The test actually is going to open right at 9 today, this morning. It's set to open there. And I know that I said that I wanted you to get it done by tomorrow, but I've extended that through not only through the weekend, but on Monday. And so you have all day on Monday if you need it. You know, you can always go to school and do it there or something. I know the counselor's office has Respondus. So if you need to take it there, you can do that sometime on Monday, or sometime tomorrow. Make sure you've read all of the stories that you need to read and you got them. And anything you don't understand really well, like if you read a story and go, okay, I just don't even sort of get it, go to the lecture for that. I labeled all of them in the recording so you can go to the actual lecture that you need, so that you're all ready to take the test. But you have to have Respondus and you have to have a webcam. And then as long as you have that, then you can take the test, and it should only, I mean, I have it set as 75 minutes, but I've never had a student that took 75 minutes to take it. So my tests usually take, most people will finish in about 45 minutes. So you could even take it tomorrow morning at the 8 o'clock hour and you'd still be able to get to school by the second period. So that would be easy. But just make sure, and there's a mixture of questions. There are a lot of multiple choice, but there's also a matching section, mostly with literary terms, like the different parts of plot structure, the different, characters, things like that, point of view, narration. And then there are several questions that say check all that apply. And so it's a multiple answer question, and you want to kind of get, there are several answers that are correct, and you want to get them all because you get points. There's a point for each one of the answers in that particular question, and there's several of those. So, and then there's one essay, and then there's even a 5-point, up to 5-point extra credit that you can get. So just carefully read the instructions for each question, make sure that you're doing it correctly, and you don't, if there are 8 answers, you can pretty much know that that's a multiple answer question. But it always says click, check as, all that apply. So I try to give you really clear instructions. Okay, let's talk about Metamorphosis. And it's what we call, it's absurdist. And it's the only way I can really describe it. And Kafka is known for this. He's actually, I mean, he wrote in German, but he lived in Prague most of his life anyway. And he was Jewish, but he passed away in 1924. So he wasn't Jewish. He was actually buried in a Jewish cemetery and everything, but he passed away before like World War II happened. So Hitler came to power in just a little after that time. And then by 1929, he had taken power, and he was starting, all of the stuff that would go through and eventually become the Holocaust. Had Gregor lived, he actually died. I mean, had Franz lived, he actually died of tuberculosis. So, which that was at that point incurable. They didn't know how, people just kind of wasted away, coughed themselves to death, and it was a horrible way to die. But a lot of people, actually, he was only 40 years old, and a lot of people, we actually have some other writers who died that way. Keats, who will be in the poetry section, he wrote several really cool poems that I like. He's one of my favorite romantic poets, but his brother died of tuberculosis, and he tended him and took care of him until he died. Then his mother died of tuberculosis, and then finally he died of tuberculosis. And he was only 29, 27. I mean, he was very young. I think he was 29. And so, I mean, this was a common thing for people to die of that kind of wasting disease. But Metamorphosis is not about that, really. At least on the surface, it's not. It's about, well, what happens to Gregor? There's this kid He's a young man, but he's working full time at a really he's a traveling salesman, which is not the easiest job, but he works really hard and he's very dependable, but he's supporting his family. So his mom and dad are at home. His mom has asthma and she's, she mostly just putters around the house. His dad will sometimes spend all day in his pajamas. And his sister is going to school. She's 17. She's like finishing up regular school, and he wants to essentially raise enough money to make it so that she can go to the conservatory and learn, she studies the violin now, but he wants to get her, really good instructions so she can go be a violinist. But what happens to Gregor Samsa instead? So he's just in the moment, he's just goes to sleep one night and he wakes up, and what happened? He turns into a bug. Yeah, he's okay, so it's hard to know exactly how big he is, but he's wider than he normally was. So he can't fit in his doorway. He has a 2-door doorway, so if one door is open, that's not wide enough for the bug. So he's like either a big, I don't know, beetle, but he's gigantic. I mean, he's smaller. He's not as tall as he was, of course, but he's has a hard shell on his back. He has little bitty spindly legs underneath, and he just wakes up literally like that on his back in bed. And of course, that doesn't happen in real life. That's why we say it's absurdist, because the whole idea of this premise is absurd. I want to make a story where some guy wakes up one morning and he's a bug. Well, it doesn't happen in real life. So we start out with the absurd, and we actually start out with him even going, okay, well, so what do I do? Like he's thinking, I need to get to work. He's more troubled by the fact that he can't get out of bed and he needs to get dressed and go to work and he's missed the first train than he is that he's a bug. Like literally. And so that's why it's also absurdist. Most of us, I mean, well, all of us probably, if I were to wake up as a bug, um, I don't think I'd be worried about going to work, or getting dressed, or, I'm a bug. Like, oh no, what the heck happened? And he doesn't sit there and wonder. He actually is just like, what? I mean, he says what's happening to me, but then he just starts feeling his body parts, and he's like, oh my gosh, what? I got these little spindly legs, and I can barely raise my head, and when he's on his back, it's hard for him to flip over. It was hard for him to get up off the bed and get down to the floor without hurting himself. In fact, he hurt himself several times just trying to move around that first day. But instead, what he's worrying about is all the things he has to do. So before all of this happened, though, because we get a lot of details about his family, details about his mom and dad and his sister and his house and his work, his job, all that stuff. What was his life like before he became a bug? What was his boss like? Was he fun? Was it a great place to work? Yeah, and easily angered. If Gregor didn't show up for work and he'd been there without fail, he hadn't missed a day in like 5 years, but he missed this morning. He missed the train and everything. And the man literally came to his house demanding to know what's wrong with you. Why are you not at work? Can you imagine? Of course, this is absurdist, but can you imagine in today's world people coming to your house because you didn't show up for work today? No one would come to my house. They'd call me maybe and go, hey, are you okay? But they wouldn't come to my house. And there are a lot of, I mean, especially in this kind of a job, there, the kind that he works, it may be that it takes 3 or 4 days for people to even figure out he didn't go because he's a traveling salesman. So maybe he's gone already or something like that. But the truth is this guy is like on it. He's I guess he's checking boxes whenever people show up at work. Yep, he's here, he's here, he's here, he's, doing like a timesheet or something. And so Gregor normally gets up at 4 in the morning. And don't tell me you guys do, because I know I don't. And I get up pretty early, but I get up at 6, but 4 in the morning every morning so that he can catch the train to work and be there super early. And so he misses that first train. When he wakes up, he says, "Didn't the alarm go off?" And he actually, I've already missed this train. And then he's like, "Well, I can make this other train, but then people will be all upset because I'm coming in late." And he even says, he didn't love his job. He's exhausted and he has to travel all the time and stay in crappy hotels. And he doesn't know anybody and he feels lonely. So he already wasn't working a great job. Now, why did he have to work so hard though? What made it so that, what was his family situation like? What had happened to his parents? Right. His dad's business had made a mess and put him in debt to this particular other person. And so he was essentially working off the debt, and he hoped in like 5 or 6 years, if he worked really, really, really hard, and he'd already been promoted and he was going, doing pretty well in that, but he gave almost all of his money to his family to help his parents pay off his debts. Did they use all of the money? No. They actually had saved quite a bit of it, but didn't tell him. They also were not in as bad straits as he thought they were, he finds out later. They had saved some of their old money. So they had more money than he thought. And he was under the impression that without him, they were all absolutely destitute. Now, they were not good off financially, but essentially 3 people, he was working for all 4 of them and he was the breadwinner for everybody. Now, think about the pressure okay, you guys are high school students. Say in 2 or 3 years, you're expected to work full time to pay your parents and all of, if I don't know if you guys have siblings or not. I was one of 7 kids. So if I suddenly, my dad says I can't work anymore and he ends up on disability, but that only brings in so much money. And so I have to go get a full-time job so that my parents can pay their rent or their mortgage and pay the light bill and, feed the family and those types of things. That's a tremendous amount of strain. Even the father of a family, you know, when he has to be the one, the wife's at home. This is a very traditional household that you're looking at with Gregor, but a lot of people live in this kind of household where the wife stays at home and the husband goes out and he has to work as good a job as he can so that he can make as much money as he can and they can support, they can feed the family, have a nice home, have clothes, that kind of stuff. So he's doing all of that. It's all the pressure is on him. And so even though this is absurdist, that he turned into a bug, what he's dealing with, the reality of a situation is real. And this is also very typically Kafka, that he writes in very realistic situations with some element of the absurd or the fantastical thrown in. And that's really kind of that's what he's known for. In fact, they even use the term Kafkaesque, and I'm just going to put that right over here. Kafkaesque, to denote something that seems really realistic, except it has some weird wrench thrown in it. And this is this is probably, of all of his short stories, this most represents what I see when I read Kafka. So he's now in this weird situation where he was the breadwinner and suddenly he can't work. And he really can't. He cannot work. he starts to talk. He's trying to talk to people, even talking through the door, and they're like, his voice sounds weird. And then after a while, they can't understand him at all. Everything he's trying to say, he remains lucid all the way through his whole story. He recognizes his parents, recognizes his sister, cares about them, can remember what his life was like before, but he can't communicate with them anymore. Anything he says just sounds like an insect going or whatever, and it freaks them out. He can't even move towards them because they see that as threatening. So he can no longer really interact with his parents and his sister the way that he once did. Now, does this make you think of anything that is real, like that could happen to a person? Yeah, we don't turn into bugs, but what else can happen to change our situation? Sometimes overnight. Not turning into a bug, but what else could happen so that we're, we're humming along, doing everything normal, going to work, coming home, keeping a schedule, being dependable. And what can happen? What can change? What about physically? How can we change physically? Not turning into a bug, but what else could happen? Yeah, we could get sick. Where, I mean, okay, think about COVID. Somebody gets COVID and, they had what's that called? Long COVID? Actually, my aunt has long COVID. She had a compromised immune system, but it took her a while to get COVID. She finally did though. And she's going to be dealing with excessive fatigue and lung issues for the rest of her life. Okay, but it could be worse than that. Like they could end up we have a bunch of other stuff. What if they get something like lupus or fibromyalgia, or they come down with mono or meningitis, or, I mean, there's so many conditions that can have long-term effects. They could have, what's that? There's that one MS, multiple sclerosis. There's so many things that even as an adult, you could get cancer. And just the treatment alone, like what if you get leukemia? If you're struggling with leukemia, that is a really tough struggle. And it becomes impossible to do the things, especially because the treatment for leukemia is so extensive. It's not like regular chemotherapy. It really isn't. Where you may be sick, really, really sick for at least a year, and you may have to do several rounds of chemo treatment. So the truth is any of those things can make you sick. What about emotionally or mentally? What can happen? What if the pressure gets to you and you become like, you go and you start drinking? Or in fact, I was just watching it was on Netflix. It's new, but it was about a skating pair. The guy was from Australia and the girl was from Russia, and she had an alcohol problem. Yeah, depression. And you think about what kind of a life this boy lives. And Gregor all the pressure is on him. He's living in a little bitty bedroom, just probably his childhood bedroom, but he's doing the work to support three other people and himself at a very young age. That's really rough. And people crack under that kind of pressure. So he could have depression, he could become, really anxious or develop other kinds of emotional disorders. Maybe he becomes OCD or obsessive compulsive, or he could become manic depressive. There are a lot of different things that, just the anxiety alone can make it so he won't want to go outside the house anymore. This happens to people all the time. And the pressure can make it worse. And the loneliness of his job, the fact that even when he'd come home, well, when he could come home, when he wasn't on the road in a hotel by himself, even when he came home, he really wasn't, the only person he really talked to was his sister before all of this happened. And, his dad everybody kind of shows their true colors a bit once this switches. But when someone's battling the depression, it's even worse than a physical ailment, because you can see a wheelchair, but you can't see depression. And so people don't understand it, and they don't know how to talk to you, and they don't know. I mean, I had my husband actually worked through cancer at the age of 42. He was very young. And he's been in remission for 8 years now, 9 years now. Um, but there were friends that never even called him through the whole year because they said they didn't know what to say to him. And there are tons of people, somebody loses a family member and nobody even acknowledges it because they don't want to talk about it. It's too negative. And so this person ends up being even more isolated because they can't even talk about the grief that they're going through. And that gets really hard. So in some ways, the story is about Gregor, but it's also about a totally different struggle, and that's his family, because they don't understand what he's going through. But who do we side with? Who are you most, or do you have probably equal sympathy for both him and his family? Or do you have more sympathy for him or more sympathy for his family? What do you guys think? And you can be honest. It's okay okay, so you have more sympathy for him. And one reason that might be, well, it's because we're inside his head. And we talked about narration before, and when we have what's called limited omniscient, that means the narrator is inside somebody's head, but he's only inside the main character's head. So we don't get to go inside the thoughts of dad and mom and the sister. We only are inside Gregor's head. And that means that we will tend to be more empathetic towards Gregor than we are the other people. But the truth is too, is we get to experience what he gets to experience. The pain of trying to raise his head, the getting one of his legs smashed so it just kind of drags around. That's the first day too. He smashes his leg. And he also gets a scar all on one side because he gets shoved through the door by his dad. And his dad's definitely the most angry of all I mean, he's more angry than Gregor is. Gregor just feels kind of helpless and after a while quite hopeless, but his dad is really, he's angry at him, and he's afraid of him. Well, they're all kind of afraid of him, but he doesn't exactly treat him with any gentleness. And you wonder too what kind of a dad he was when Gregor was little, because he so quickly, even on that first day, he so quickly resorts to violence. The dad's really rough, and he's the reason. I mean, what does he do to Gregor the first day when Gregor accidentally like scoots out of the room? He's trying to talk to his parents, of course. He's trying to talk to his family and explain what's going on and explain to his boss why he couldn't come into work. Obviously, he's turned into a bug. No one understands him. What does his dad do? You remember? Okay, let's go back. Okay, so Gregor is trying to explain to his boss, I'm going to open the door, I promise, but of course it's all, it sounds like, yeah, he's like going after him, and he's trying to get him back into the door. And the sister, everybody's kind of freaking out. Gregor is ill, quick, get the doctor. And that's just based on what he sounds like. And he opens the door, and while he's talking, there he goes. I'll get dressed straight away, pack up my samples, and set off. Will you please just let me leave? You can see that I'm not stubborn and I like to do my job. He's talking and talking and talking. The boss literally just shakes his head, looking at him, and backs away and then leaves. Doesn't even say a word to him. And then, let's see, but he's already outside. So he goes, and then he tries to talk to his mom, and she runs away. She already had screamed, but now she's screaming anew, fled from the table and into the arms of his father. And he's trying to go after the chief clerk, but no. But the father's not even going to let him go. Literally, Gregor's father seized the chief clerk's stick in his right hand, picked up a large newspaper from the table with his left, and used them to drive Gregor back into his room. But remember, the door is only partly open. So he has one of the two, it has two narrow doors that should, and he only has one of them open. He stood up and kind of scooted sideways out through that door because he has a wide body. Well, now he's on the ground and he's crawling back, but he can't stand back up. And for a while, he's like walloping him, and Gregor has to turn around. He can't back up. He has to actually turn his body around and go forward because that's how his new insect body works. But it freaks out the dad because he's not moving. And so essentially, Gregor's trying to get through, but he knows he can't get through that door. And he's afraid that his dad's going to kill him. He even says, he goes, there was the threat of a lethal blow to the back of his back or head from the stick in his father's hand. And he says he realized that he had no choice as he saw to his disgust that he was quite incapable of going backwards. So he's trying to scooch slowly and unthreateningly around. And his dad the whole time is like whapping him with his stick and hissing at him. And it really messes with Gregor. I mean, think about, if somebody's yelling at you, how confused it and messed up it makes you. And so eventually Gregor does turn around and he's trying to go in, but it said, it sounded to Gregor as if there was now more than one father behind him. It was not a pleasant experience, and Gregor pushed himself into the doorway. But remember, he's got one side of his body is lifting up so he can squish through. But his dad, he gets stuck. And so his dad actually shoves him. Then his father gave him a hefty shove from behind, which released him from where he was held and sent him flying and heavily bleeding deep into his room. The door was slammed shut with a stick. Then finally, all was quiet. So his dad physically injures him the very first day. And he's got a gash all down the side of him because his dad won't wait for him to try to scoot through the door. He's so repulsed by everything that he shoves him. Now, if we think about this in the terms of not just the absurdity of being a bug, but when you have a condition that even if your parents understand what it is, but they get tired of it. And I've seen this. My sister has two autistic children, and one of them is verbal. And I mean, her son is now, he's a year older than my son, so he's 20. He's out of school now, but he's nonverbal, and he can get really angry. And by this point, he's over 200 pounds, very tall, and he can, get physical. And so my sister, while she is patient with him, she reaches the end of her tether far more than she knows she should. And he's really difficult to deal with. And she's not sure what to do half the time. And now she doesn't have him in therapy anymore. And should he be? Yeah. But the state paid for most of it before, when he was in public school. And so she's in an impasse. And he also has an eating disorder that makes him eat things that are not food. And so he's been in and out of the hospital for that reason too. I can't remember what they call it. It's a terrible disorder. It's awful. And a lot of autistic kids have it. And so even though she's trying to be patient with him, it's a stress to her day that he does, she has to be really careful about what she leaves out. And one time he ate an entire bottle of, not the bottle, but all the pills in it. He ate an entire bottle of Tylenol, and they had to pump his stomach, and he almost died. And this was when he was probably 11 or 12 years old. And so he's already been injured several times. He's had to have surgery several times because of the things he's eating. So that type of stress is really horrible for him. And it's a compulsion he simply can't battle. But it's also a stress for her. And so in some ways, I mean, I don't know that we're unsympathetic with the family. Like, you guys can tell me what you think, but we're more sympathetic because Gregor's the one who's actually, he had to go, he went through this transformation. He went through the metamorphosis into a bug. And so his case is really the most sad. And yet, do you understand how it affected his family too? You know, some of it was just embarrassment. You know, they don't want to, they hide him. They don't want to, you know, anybody to know. But a lot of it is because, you know, like the one maid ran screaming, the cook eventually quit. So people were just uncomfortable being around Gregor, or, you know, knowing that he existed. But over time, how does the family treat him differently? He's actually there for, he falls asleep eventually. And he, where does he make his, does he go back on the bed? No. Where does he sleep? Yeah, he tucks himself under, I think it's under the couch as much as he can. He's kind of squishy back, you know, squished under there, but he doesn't want them to get horrified by him, which is a horrible place to be. When you know that you horrify people, that's sad. But he even gets a sheet off of his bed to cover himself up, and so that when he's under there, no one can see him, and his sister won't have to like deal with the fact that he is hideous, even though he's the one who really has to deal with it, you know, and can't do anything anymore. What did the parents do? What does the dad do that he didn't do before or hadn't done for a while? Not to Gregor, but in his life. What does his dad, how does his dad's life change? Yes. Okay, so Andrea, he starts working and he seems like he wears his uniform. He seems really happy to hold a job. What does that indicate to you though? I mean, I don't know if you thought the same thing I did. When I saw that his dad was back to working, I literally wondered, well, why wasn't he working before? Then it wouldn't have had, yeah, he was totally capable to work. He just chose not to, and that, and to put pressure all on Gregor. So he didn't have to. I mean, Gregor could have not been so overworked and driven because his dad could have been working too, and they would have been fine that way. But his dad didn't choose to work until he had no other choice. Now think about it this way. Do you know people who, if they can sponge off other people, they'd just rather do that? Because I do. I mean, I literally, I have a sibling who, you know, she was finally told by my parents, look, you have to go get yourself a job, and, or, you know, go to school or get yourself a job. She went to school, and then right, almost immediately, as soon as she was out of school, she was married to somebody. And I don't know that she's held a job since. But there are a lot of people like that. You know, some of us are more driven. I don't know when you guys learned. Did you guys get your learner's permit? I got my learner's permit when I was, I guess, 16. I didn't get my driver's license until I was like 17 and a half. But my sister was 25 before she got her license. Because she says, I don't need to drive anywhere. My husband will drive me. Oop. You know. So some people are that way, where they don't, if they could avoid having a job, they would totally avoid it. If they could avoid going to school, they would avoid it. If they could avoid being responsible for a dog or a cat or anything, they would avoid it. If they had somebody that they could pay to, or someone else paid to clean their room, they would totally take that and let somebody else do all the work for them. There are people who don't know how to do dishes, who couldn't clean a toilet if you gave them the right stuff to do it, who've never cleaned anything, and they've never held a job. And they, you know, so Gregor was not that kind of a guy at all. But his parents kind of, you know, they sat back and let him take all of the load. And it hurt him. You know, this certainly suggests that the parallel isn't just him turning it into a bug, but him collapsing, him having a nervous breakdown and being unable to work anymore. You know, it's the parallel, even though it seems absurd this way, this is something he can't change. You can't just make yourself not a bug anymore. And yet the way he's treated is very similar to the way someone who's on disability, or, you know, what if he had an accident at work and he came home and he'd broken his back, or, you know, he had something that made it so he could no longer do the job he was supposed to do. People could very well, you know, he ends up an invalid in his room, and people could treat him just as badly. Like, oh, he's so useless now. And so he's not even a real person. So with her, though, with the sister, she's a little bit of an exception. She's the one who feeds him. She's the one who cleans his room. And she, at first, she puts a bunch of stuff, you know, she gives him some food that he used to like, you know, when he wasn't bug. And he didn't like the food. It was milk with bread in it and stuff, which is funny because that's, my mom used to eat that as a kid. And she ate it even while I've never eaten it. I've never soaked, you know, just put pieces of bread inside milk and eaten that. But my mom really liked it. And so he used to, well, he won't eat it now as a bug. So she ends up putting this whole smorgasbord out on a piece of newspaper, and you know, rotten vegetables, and also, but he likes all the rotten stuff, all the stuff that's spoiling, all the stuff that he would never eat before he liked. So it even says they're all spread out. It's right here. Even a few raisins and almonds. He loved the cheese. And so she's noticing that. And for a while, and you can see the transformation, especially with his sister, because for a while, she really tries to feed him things that she thinks he likes. But after a while, he doesn't, you know, he eats less, and she cares less about what she feeds him. And she doesn't seem to notice. But at first she notices, oh, you really like that food. You know, he's enjoyed his dinner today. Of course, she's talking about him in third person. And then now everything's just been left there again. So she notices when he doesn't eat. Well, after a while, she doesn't make any comments. And after a while, she cleans less than she did. And every time she walks into the room, she goes and opens the window. Like, she can't bear to be in the room with him without like fresh air. And so maybe he stinks. We don't know. Probably he does. I mean, you know, after a while, especially, he begins to not really care about himself. Now, what about, there is that point where those three visitors, well, they're staying in they essentially hire a room out. They rent a room. And usually when they did this is pretty typical. It's room and board, which means that it includes room and then at least like breakfast and dinner. So then you can go to work in the meantime. But then you come home, you have dinner, and that's included in the rent. That everybody, you know, some ladies actually, if they're a widow and they have a big house, you know, they're left and they can't afford it on their own, so they let the rooms out, all the bedrooms, and then they make breakfast in the morning, and everybody who rents the rooms eats their breakfast, then they go off to work, come home, they have dinner ready, and they all eat together, and then they go to their respective rooms. It's I mean, it's actually called a boarding house, and it's where people get room and board. But so they have that, and the men are kind of gruff and bossy and everything else, and they have to have everything super clean. So Gregor has to be like tucked away back in his room. They don't even know Gregor exists until one night. What changes things that night? Let me see if I can find. His mother doesn't ever really see it. When she finally does see him, it's just awful. So she can't seem to take any, even though she cleans his room once, Greta gets all mad at her. Let's see. Trying to find. Oh yeah, it's And he actually comes out once, and the mom gets all freaked out, and then the dad chases him back in. How does the dad chase him back in the second time when he comes out? Because Gregor came out trying to say, Mom, it's okay, blah, 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 and it freaked out Mom. Mom fainted, then Greta got all mad, and everybody's yelling. And the father thinks that he had done something bad, that Gregor had done something bad, that, violent. That's why Mom had fainted. And so what does the dad do? And Gregor did not have time to calm his father or explain things, even if that had been possible. Remember, they can't understand what he says. So he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it, so that his father, when he came in from the hall, could see straight away that Gregor had the best intentions and would go back into his room without delay. That it would not be necessary to drive him back, but that they had only to open the door and he would disappear. But his dad does what instead? But he doesn't even recognize his dad. He says he really ought to have expected things to have changed, but still, was that really his father? And his dad's not tired anymore. He's not, and he's still wearing his uniform. He's stronger, and he's, certainly more dominant than he was for a while. And what does he do? What does dad? He starts chucking stuff at him. What is he chucking at him? Yeah, he throws a bunch of fruit. Apples. And then right beside him, lightly tossed, something flew down and rolled in front of him, an apple. Then another one immediately flew at him. Gregor froze in shock. There was no longer any point in running, as his father had decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with fruit from the bowl on the sideboard, and now, without even taking the time for careful aim, threw one apple after another. And the little red apples rolled about on the floor, knocking into each other as if they had electric motors. An apple thrown without much force glanced against Gregor's back and slid off without doing any harm. Another one, however, immediately followed it, hit squarely, and lodged in his back. Gregor wanted to drag himself away as if he could remove the incredible pain by changing his position. But he felt as if nailed to the spot and spread himself out, all his senses in confusion. The last thing he saw was the door of his room being pulled open. His sister was screaming. His mother ran out in front of her in her blouse, because she was having an asthma attack. And now Gregor lost his ability to see anything. And the mom actually had her hands behind his father's head, begging him to spare Gregor's life. Don't kill him. That's why I say dad's the angriest one. So even though she fainted and was horrified by her own son, she begs him not to die. But then, not to kill the son. She recognizes still that this at least was Gregor, if it's not anymore. But then he goes back in the room. No one dared to remove the apple, so it remained there as a visible reminder of his injury. So imagine, that's like somebody stabs you in the back with a knife, and then they just leave it there. And for the rest of your life, you've got that sticking out of your back. That's essentially what's going on with Gregor. And it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. They couldn't even go in and go, could you just, pull the apple out or something? No, it's just sitting in there, probably rotting. And even dad feels a little bad about it. So for a month, he had suffered it there for more than a month. And his condition seemed serious enough to remind his father that Gregor, despite his current sad and revolting form, was a family member. So dad feels guilty about it, but not enough to take the apple out of the poor thing's back. And Gregor's getting worse. He's getting sick, and he's weak, and he doesn't want to eat anymore. And he can't move the way he could. Before, he was moving all up and down the walls, which is horrifying to think about. And yet what else is he supposed to do? He's a bug, and yet now he can hardly, I mean, he even says he doesn't dare crawl on the ceiling. Like he says, crawling over the ceiling was out of the question. But what the parents do, because they feel bad about it, they open the door and let him listen to them talk and hang out in the evening. But they only do it in the evening. He's not really eating much at this point, probably because he's really sick and he's injured and he's not recovering. So mom is actually taking in some sewing and his dad's still working and everything like that. But then we get to the point where they have, um, they allow Gregor to essentially listen in on their family and watch, but they don't, he's never included. Like they open the door so he can listen, but both he and the family understand he's not supposed to come out. Just stay in your room, stay hidden, but you can at least sort of be part of the family in an indirect sort of way, if that makes sense. And the parents are working harder. They're trying to make ends meet, but they talk sometimes at night about how they really wish they could get into a smaller apartment and then they could afford it. So in other words, they feel like they can't live the life they want to because of Gregor. They can't move him, or really they can. They just have to put him in a little crate and then they can move him. But they're too embarrassed about, people seeing that he exists and what he looks like or anything, And so they're not moving. So they take in, sorry, my voice, I told you my allergies were kicking in. But then they take in those 3 people and those 3, essentially one night his sister Greta is playing the violin for them and he comes out to listen. He's just mesmerized by how beautiful the playing is. And it's funny too, because Gregor sometimes, he can smell what they're eating, and he noticed, I mean, he just hasn't eaten it probably in weeks. And so we know, I mean, you could probably get the foreshadowing that things are not going well and that he's not going to survive this. But he really comes out and this kind of messes with everything. He comes out when he hears her playing. And then finally the men are the first people to notice. But the music, I mean, again, Gregor's still Gregor. Inside, he's still himself. And he hasn't lost any of his actual mind. He just can't do any of the things, he can't express any of them outside. And the truth is, are there conditions where a person becomes truly mute? Yeah. Are there conditions where they can no longer really express themselves verbally? Yes. Does it mean they can't understand anything? No, it doesn't. So, but again, of course, now we have these 3 men and they're all like horrified by the bug. And again, they're all angry about it. And so again, here's dad. The dad first tries to calm the 3 gentlemen before driving Gregor out, even though they were not at all upset and seemed to think Gregor was more entertaining than the violin playing had been. He rushed up to them with his arms spread out and attempted to drive them back to their room at the same time as trying to block their view of Gregor. And yet they just thought he was really fascinating. Of course, they're not his relatives. They don't have to be horrified. They don't know that he was the son either. And so finally they get them in there, when dad's gets the 3 men in the room, then finally they say, well, we're not going to stay in this house anymore. We give immediate notice. And for the days that I've been living here, I will of course pay nothing because this is awful. This is terrible treatment of people. Of course, should he have paid for his room and board? Yes. But now all of that stuff they'd done, all the effort they'd made for these people, it was going to be for free. And so the 2 other men agree, and then they go back in their room and shut the door. And he's upset. But Gregor's father, rather than blame them for being jerks. Instead, everybody blames Gregor. How dare he come out of his room and show his ugly self to everybody? Again, of course, now he looks worse than he did. He's all covered with dust. He's not clean anymore. Plus, he's got an apple sticking out of his back in an open sore. I mean, it's awful. But that's when Greta essentially says, we can't live like this. And she even says, we have to try and get rid of it. She doesn't even call him a him, but it. It'll be the death of both of you. I can see it coming. We can't all work as hard as we have to and then come home to be tortured like this. We can't endure it. I can't endure it anymore. And then Father says, if he could just understand us. And we know, because we're inside, that he can. He can understand us. But Gregor knows, and because he can understand them, he knows that he is causing all of the, he takes it upon himself, and he realizes how much they resent him, how much they wish that he were dead. So what happens to him? He says, maybe they'll let me turn around. And he went back, trying to get back into his room. He was hardly inside his room before the door was hurriedly shut. His sister did it, bolted and locked. The sudden noise behind Gregor so startled him that his little legs collapsed under him. And then she says, at last. And what happens to Gregor? That night, he watched as essentially he remained in the state of empty and peaceful rumination until he heard the clock's tower strike 3. He watched as it slowly began to get light everywhere outside the window too. Then, without his willing it, his head sank down completely, and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. He dies. And it's such a sad way to die. You think about of all the things, what did I last say to somebody and they have a car accident, and I said something mean, and you never get over that. In this case, though, I mean, they said horrible things. He goes in and dies. That night he dies. And when he is found the next day, of course, the charwoman finds him, and she just thinks it's fascinating. She actually takes care of his body, though she doesn't say how she does it. They don't want to know. But she says, don't worry about the bug. I took care of him, that kind of thing. But the family all they are is relieved. They go out and oh, well, we haven't been able to leave in so long. So they all leave. They essentially all play hooky from work. And they go out and celebrate, if you want to think about it that way. Let's forget about all that old stuff, shall we? Come and give me a bit of attention. This is the dad. Come and take care of me now. We don't have to worry about that other thing. And they're all ecstatic. They're not even grieving. Now that he's gone, they can get a flat, an apartment that was smaller and cheaper, in a better location. And he even said that cheaper than the current one, which had been chosen by Gregor, who had chosen it based on his work. And he was paying for it. And with all the worry they had been having of late, her cheeks had become pale, but now the daughter was blossoming into a well-built and beautiful young lady. Then they kind of find her a good husband, and they live happily ever after. It's awful. I don't know how you guys felt about it. I had some sympathy for them until he died. And then they were so happy that they didn't have to look at him ever again. And it's, in a way, it's very much, it resembles, though, this reality, that somebody's going through horrible things, and as much as some people in their family might be sympathetic, they're tired, and they'd be relieved if all of this would go away. And it's so sad. It's probably the saddest story of all the ones that we've read. This is probably, for me, I mean, I think shooting an elephant is pretty sad. This is sadder. Maybe because I care more about Gregor by the end. And I mean, he's stuck and he can't communicate with anybody, and there's no way out. And yet by the end, they just hate him. And that's awful. So anyway, on that fantastically fun note, we are done with class. It's 9:01. I assume you guys have to get to school. So any questions, any comments? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.